The Joint Committee will please come to order. We will resume the testimony of General Singlaub. May I call upon Mr. Van Cleve.
General, good afternoon. I have only a few brief questions this afternoon. There are just a couple of topic areas that I'd like to cover with you. I'd like to start by talking with you about the fundraising efforts that you engaged in 1984 and 1985 in connection with countries 3 and 5. That general
84,
subject.
85.
Right.
Yeah.
You testified yesterday that you met with the Washington representatives of these countries in late November or early December 1984. The first question I wanted to ask you is whether or not Oliver North had asked you to approach these countries prior to those contacts with their Washington representatives.
No, because I was good friends with those head of delegation here. I suggested that that might be a lucrative source of funds. We had discussed the problem of getting funding, and he thought that that was a good idea since I had such good relations with those people. So I did, in fact, make that with his knowledge, but he had not asked me to do it.
I see. Okay. You informed him, in effect, that you were going
correct.
to do this. Okay. And in making these contacts, you were acting as a private citizen, weren't you?
I was, and I made that very clear in the first sentence I uttered when I got in the presence of those individuals.
Okay. And in that connection, I'd like to ask you to refer to what has been previously marked as JKS Exhibit 8. It should be the last, the last but one. I think they've added a new exhibit to your book. Now, this is a memorandum dated December 4, 1984 from Oliver L. North to Robert McFarland, if you have the same exhibit that I do. Is that correct? Okay. If you look at page 2 of this document, General, you'll see that it begins, later that afternoon, Gen. Jack Singlaub visited to advise of 2 meetings he had held early in the day regarding support for the resistance. Singlaub passed on the following points, and then you can see that there's an account of 2 meetings.
Right.
And for security reasons, some of the identities have been deleted, but what I'd like to do is to ask you if you'd look at particularly the 3rd paragraph of the first of these 2 accounts of meetings, and just review that, and then tell me, I have a couple of questions about it.
Yes, I've read it.
Okay. This paragraph says, the USG is unaware of the Singlaub mission, and he is making this request based on his long friendship, and then I assume it follows some individuals' names. Because of the law restricting USG involvement, no USG official can solicit on behalf of the resistance forces. Now, what I wanted to ask you, General, is was that your account to Oliver North of what you told the official from Country 3?
Yes.
That's an accurate account.
It is.
Thank you. Now, when you met on or about December 4th with Oliver North to tell him about these meetings, and he said, according to your testimony yesterday, that he saw no objections to the course of action that you were suggesting, I take it that what he meant was that it was consistent with the President's policy and that because you were a private citizen, you were free to do this in any event. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you. Turning now to the trips that you made in early January of 1985.
Mm-hmm.
When you approached officials of Country 3 in early 1985, they were concerned, as I understand it, about whether making a contribution to the Contras was consistent with United States government policy. Is that correct?
That's one of their concerns,
Oh,
right.
Okay. Would it be fair to say it was a major concern of theirs?
Yes.
Okay. And to reassure the officials of Country 3 on this point, you told them that you thought you could arrange to have a signal sent. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Did you have any basis at that time for your belief that a signal could be sent to Country 3 other than your view that administration policy generally favored the Contras?
No, I didn't think of it in advance, but when I got there, I realized that they were going to have to take my presentation on faith and the fact that they'd known me for a long time. But I realized that the ones that I was dealing with were not necessarily the final decision maker in that country, and that perhaps they would want to have some assurance that I was not an unguided missile ricocheting around through that part of the world. So I wanted to give them assurance that I would try to arrange, and I made it tentative, for someone who they would know is in a position to know what the President's policy is, to give a signal that they knew about my visit and understood my motives and had no objection to it.
Okay. I want to be clear on that, on exactly what you believe the nature of the signal that was to be sent was. If I understood you correctly, what you've just testified is that the signal would be to the effect that the government was aware that you would approach these other countries, that that your approach was consistent with the President's position, which was to support the Contras, and that the administration had no objection. But in other words, there was no affirmative representation that you represented the government, for example. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I knew that I could not get them to go and do the soliciting themselves.
In fact, you had already told these countries as much when you met with their D.C. representatives. Isn't that correct?
Precisely.
Okay. So that, as you put it, the purpose of the signal was simply to represent to these countries that you were not an unguided missile.
Right.
Thank you. You testified yesterday that you had had conversations about this question of a signal with Oliver North when you returned from Country 3 and Country 5 in early 1985. I understood your testimony to be that you really didn't know what had happened after that point with respect to the efforts in connection with those two countries. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So you don't know whether a signal was ever sent to this day, do you?
I don't know for first-hand knowledge. That's correct.
Okay. Did you ever have conversations, other than conversations with Oliver North and Elliott Abrams, I believe you testified to yesterday, about fundraising in connection with foreign governments? Do you ever have those conversations with any other United States government official?
I don't believe that I did have. It is possible that there were others present in the office with Elliott Abrams, his deputy.
And who was
example. That was Bill Walker.
Bill Walker. Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that I had conversations with anyone else.
Okay. So that the record is clear, was your conversation with Elliott Abrams to the same effect with respect to the nature of the signal that would be sent, as you previously have testified to in connection with your earlier activities concerning countries 3 and 5?
Well, on my first visit in January of '85, I had not made any pre-arrangements for a signal. In 1986, when I was planning another trip out there, and since I believed that no funding had been sent, I thought that the first meetings probably had aborted because there was, a signal was not sent. I wanted to have the nature of the signal or the individual who would send that established before I made the trip in 1986. Okay. That is why I went to Elliott and asked for his help in that.
I understand, and I think my question may not have been clear because you testified to that effect yesterday. My question was as to the nature of the signal itself. And again, without being too colloquial about it, was it to represent to these other governments that this is not an unguided missile?
Right, exactly.
Thank you.
It was the same type of thing.
I'd like to turn now to another subject, if I might. Could you describe for the committee, please, in general terms, the nature of your business arrangements with Geomilitech? When they began, what position you held, and as I say, in general terms, the nature of your compensation arrangement and so on.
I was asked by the president of Geomilitech if I would serve as an unpaid military consultant. I agreed to do this. I had known the president of Geomilitech, through a radio program that she had hosted in Miami. It was a very conservative, pro-freedom fighter program, and when she moved to Washington to take up this new, establish this new company, she asked if I would be a military consultant. I agreed to do that. I never received any compensation, however, for any of that.
And did Geomilitech normally sell weapons of the type that would be used or might be used by the Contras?
Did they sell them before?
Did they normally sell weapons of the type that might be used by the Contras?
No, this was the first effort that they made, that they had the contacts that I was able to use in terms of putting together the total package.
I see. Did Geomilitech receive any profits on the Contra arms deal that you arranged?
No, I regret that they didn't receive any profits at all. I believe that they actually lost money because trips were taken on behalf of my efforts to help negotiate this total package, and Geomilitech absorbed those costs.
Okay. And just so the record is clear, did you personally receive any profits in connection with that arms transaction?
None whatsoever.
Thank you. Just one final subject, if I might. You have previously testified that you were connected with fundraising on behalf of the Contras, and that you were involved in weapons purchases on behalf of the Contras. Were you involved in training the Contra forces themselves? Have you been involved in that in the past?
I've not personally, except in the way of giving advice and discussing strategy, tactics with Enrique Bermudez and some of his comandantes, but I did arrange to bring some retired military people who volunteered to do this without compensation, just for their expenses, trip down and payment of their food and place to stay while they were down there.
And have you been engaged within the last several years in the giving of general military advice to the Contras, would you say?
Yes, I would say that in terms of discussing tactics, strategy with a friend, I was never referred to as an advisor. I was referred to as a friend, but I think that we learn from our friends who have had similar experiences.
Okay. To your knowledge, has Colonel North been engaged in providing general military advice to the Contras, say during the period late 1984 to late 1986?
Well, I'm afraid I don't have any first-hand knowledge of that.
I see. You wouldn't have any first-hand knowledge. Have you been engaged in giving specific military advice on particular operations to the Contra forces?
I think that they have reviewed planned operations with me in my presence, discussed it, and asked if I had any thoughts on it.
Yes. As to specific operations?
As to a specific operation.
Okay. And to your knowledge, did Colonel North, during the period late 1984 to late 1986, provide specific military advice on particular military operations to the Contras, if you know?
I'm afraid I don't have any first knowledge of that.
I see. So is it fair to conclude then from your testimony that although you yourself are really fairly familiar with the military forces of the Contras and have been engaged in giving both general and specific military advice and so on, that to your knowledge, Colonel North has not been engaged in providing either specific or general military advice during that period?
Well, I just can't...
Based on your knowledge.
I can't give you any other information than the fact that I don't know, because we never traveled to Central America together.
I see. Okay. Do you think that there's some... I think I have no further questions of this witness, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General.
The chair recognizes.
Mr. Chairman, could I just make a point about General Singlaub's travel plans next week? And He wanted first and we both want to thank you for putting him on yesterday at some possible inconvenience to other witnesses in order to accommodate his schedule. And we appreciate coming back again today and what we would hope is, in view of he has travel plans next week, that he could finish his testimony today, possibly this evening, in order to be able to begin his travel plans that are scheduled for next week.
I'm pleased to advise you that we will complete our interrogation today.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes Representative Contra for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, I would just like to pursue for a moment the relationship you had with Oliver North, because I think it does go to the heart of some of the committee's inquiry here. You went to countries 3 and 5 in January of 1985, and your testimony is that you, in essence, were not an agent of Colonel North.
That is correct.
He did not tell you who to say, and don't, I want this to be your testimony and not mine. He did not tell you who to say, and he did not ask you or tell you what to say to these individuals or to which individuals you were supposed to see.
That is correct. He did not know the individuals that I was planning to see.
And this was something that you thought would be a good idea. It was not his idea.
That is correct.
How about with respect to other individuals in the government of the United States? Same question I have with regard to either the President, the Vice President, Admiral Poindexter, or Bud McFarland. Did any one of those individuals ask you, order you, tell you to go in January to countries 3 and 5 to see certain individuals or to say certain things to those individuals?
No.
Any other government official?
No.
In 1986, you went again to those 2 countries. The questions I have generally are the same. Did any government official, including those that I just mentioned a few moments ago, tell you who to see or what to say?
No, it was purely my idea. I was going back again. I assumed that my first effort had aborted.
In 1985, your prior testimony indicated that you did not speak with Mr. Casey.
That's correct.
In 1986, you indicated that you spoke with him a number of times. Is that not correct?
I think there's a misunderstanding here. I did speak to Mr. Casey in 1985 and 1986, but never on the subject of Nicaragua.
What specifically would be said by him if you brought up Central America or Nicaragua?
He would say, "Jack, I'll throw you out of my office." He used an expletive that I have not used, indicating that he did not want me to raise that subject with him because he clearly was an intelligence officer and probably covered by the Bolin Amendment.
You took his statement as one that was being quite sincere.
I did, yes.
With respect to your contact with Elliott Abrams of the State Department, you indicated just a few moments ago that you had met with him. Was it ever alone, or was there always Foreign Service officers present?
I cannot remember ever meeting with him alone. Usually he had his deputy or perhaps one other with him.
Did Elliott Abrams ever ask you to stay in touch with those Foreign Service officers that were?
Yes, he did.
Did Mr. Abrams ever discourage you from making contacts with foreign governments?
No.
Did Mr. Abrams ever suggest to you that you should go to foreign countries and solicit funds?
No, he did not.
He did not, therefore, similar to the other statements or questions, did not ask you to go to countries 3 or 5 or tell you who you were supposed to see there or tell you what you were supposed to ask them.
That's correct.
You didn't make, General, much money by your help in Central America, did you?
Make any money? No, I did
That's
not
not
make
much. Why did you do it?
Well, I tried to explain that in my opening statement, that I believe in the cause. I have devoted my life to trying to advance the cause of freedom. I just feel that I still have some energy left. I have some experience that might be useful in this fight. I believe it's in the interest of this country to get as many people working with the freedom fighters as possible. So I've decided to do that.
In 1984, the record is pretty obvious. I think it was December 1984, the Bolin Amendment was passed. There was a prohibition of United States military aid to the Contras. What was the effect of that cutoff of aid to the democratic resistance in Central America? And while you answer that question very quickly, if you would, were there plans that the Contras had that had to be canceled because of the termination of the prospects for aid?
Actually, the Bolin Amendment, and there were really several Bolin amendments, but the one that had the greatest impact went into effect before December of 1984. For all intents and purposes, the supplies that had been purchased were consumed by early fall of 1984. Yes, there were plans that could not be executed because they did not have enough money to buy food, to buy replacement clothing, boots, and it's a very pathetic thing to see these brave young men, many of them wounded, staggering into their base camps with shredded uniforms, boots that are falling off of them, and out of ammunition. And that was their condition.
There also, if I might ask, with respect to the Bolin Amendment and particularly Soviet involvement with regard to supplies to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, there came a time, did there not, that the Soviet Union shipped Hind helicopters to Central America, Nicaragua?
That is about the same time that our Congress cut off all aid to those freedom fighters.
Hind helicopters are pretty sophisticated fighting machines, would you not say?
I have described it as the most effective people-killing machine in the world.
They're fairly expensive to the Soviet Union, I would imagine.
Quite.
I would imagine the Soviet Union, because of their sophistication, because of their cost, would not want to lose many of them, either in battle or to the United States or to some other side that may be able to reverse engineer them. Is that a fair statement?
That's a true statement.
Did you ever have any conversations, or in your opinion, as a military leader with vast experience, would you conclude that it may very well have been the fact that the United States was at a time incapable of giving sophisticated defenses against that type of a weapon? In other words, we couldn't have any surface-to-air missiles, no blowpipes, no shoulder-fired stingers. Because of that, do you think that the Hind helicopters were sent to Nicaragua because they could be used and they would not be threatened, i.e. they would not be lost, they would be safe? Is that reasonable?
It is reasonable, quite.
We heard other people mention the fact that the Soviet bloc countries had given from 1983 to 86 about over $3 billion of aid to the Sandinista government. The United States aid during the time it was permitted was significantly less than that. The results of those $3 billion of aid to the Sandinista government, did that create an efficient fighting force in Central America?
Well, it is certainly the largest and the best equipped force in Central America. In view of the defections from that force, I would say that it's probably not the most efficient force, but by the size of both the number of men and the equipment they have, it is the most powerful force south of the Rio Grande.
How does it compare, for example, to Costa Rica, the military fighting capability of Costa Rica?
Costa Rica has no military fighting capability. They have no armed forces at all. They have a small police force only.
Is the military force of the Sandinistas primarily defensive, offensive, or would it be a mix?
Looking at the sophistication of the weapon systems and the weapons in the other countries, it appears to be clearly an offensive force. the number of tanks they have, the number of armored personnel carriers, the number of artillery weapons indicate that it is an offensive military force.
There's been great deal said about Soviet bloc aid to Central America, to the Sandinistas, since the revolution in 1979. From your experience in talking with people living in that part of the world, do you know whether the Soviet bloc gave training, gave aid, gave logistics, gave information and material to the Sandinistas, in fact, before they seized power in 1979?
I believe that they did this through their surrogate, Cuba. That was an open knowledge in the area that the Sandinista forces would go to Havana, receive training. There were Cubans in the force. There were Panamanians, by the way, who assisted in that period. Today, there are roughly 11,000 foreign military forces, military and civilian advisors, all from communist countries and from terrorist organizations in Nicaragua.
General Singlaub, you're an expert, I would imagine, if anybody is, in evaluating and assisting freedom-fighting insurgencies in different parts of the world. You're familiar with Jonas Savimbi, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, what is going on in Cambodia and the resistance there. How do the Contras, the democratic resistance in Central America and Nicaragua, stack up to other types of resistance movements in the area of human rights, in morale and dedication, in corruption, those types of areas, very quickly?
Well, I believe that they not only are better motivated, they have geography on their side, which is not true of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan or of the Cambodians or the Vietnamese in Southeast Asia. They also have a better record of human rights, lack of human rights violations. They have a code of conduct that I've not found in any of the other armed forces. That's a nicety that comes later in most guerrilla organizations.
General Singlaub, thank you very much. My time is running out quickly. You know that the Congress is very happy to give aid to some democratic resistance movements, not in Central America. We can't mention the names. I would ask you the following question. By our termination of military aid to the Contras in Central America, will that affect the capabilities, the motivation, the desire, the will of those democratic resistance organizations in different parts of the world in which the United States has an interest in helping, and of course we are helping them?
Certainly, of course it does. If we are not interested enough to take care of this force that is on our borders for all intents and purposes, within walking distance of our borders, how can we possibly be a reliable ally on the other side of the world? It has had an adverse impact. It's dumbfounding, I would say, to the leaders of the democratic resistance movements in Africa and in Asia.
It's dumbfounding because we seem to be more inclined to help those resistance movements over 5,000 miles away and disinclined to help those resistance movements that are closer to our own capital than is, for example, California.
That's correct. It's irrational and immoral, in my view.
There's been a lot said about the fact that Nicaragua can never be a threat to the United States, regardless of what happens there. And my last question, General, is what is the strategic consequences to the United States if a communist totalitarian regime in Nicaragua is consolidated and with the offensive fighting force you mentioned has that freedom and has that capability?
Well, not only is the military force being created there a threat well recognized by Nicaragua's neighbors, but the bases that are being built there, both naval and air bases, are a direct threat to the United States. As Adolfo Calero mentioned yesterday, the Punta Huete big air base there is the largest air base south of the Rio Grande. It would enable the Soviets to base long-range bombers and reconnaissance aircraft there that would be a direct threat to our security. The bases that are being built on the Pacific coast would give them, for the first time, a base from which they could threaten the west coast of the United States. The obvious place for a second canal, ocean-to-ocean canal through the isthmus, is through Nicaragua. I would not want to have a canal, a second canal, in the hands of the Soviets, which it would be if we allow the Sandinistas to consolidate this communist revolution there.
I thank you, General. I thank the Chair.
Thank you very much. I yield myself 15 minutes. General, in early 1985, if my recollection is correct, you testified that you proposed that the United States government sell arms to an intermediary vendor, and that this vendor mark up the price to country 3, and that this difference between the cost and the retail price be diverted to the Contras. Is my recollection correct?
That is not quite correct, Senator Inouye. That I had mentioned as one of 3 options when I spoke to the leadership in Country 3 that I could approach if they would identify a vendor from whom they were going to buy some significant quantities of materiel, and perhaps arrange for them to split the commission. I had no specific item in mind at that time, but I had been approached by some of these same friends in that government with a request that I try to find them vendors who could sell them aircraft comparable to the F-20 that they were interested in. They were deeply concerned about their lack of anti-submarine capability. I knew that they were going to be working through vendors. I believed that the majority of the people in this country are sympathetic to the Nicaraguan freedom fighters and to President Reagan's policy of providing them with support.
Did you discuss this proposal with Colonel North?
No, I did not as a specific proposal as you're making. I did brief him that this was one of 3 options that I had proposed to Country 3.
Did he approve this, one of these 3?
I was not taking things to Colonel North for approval. At that time, I was merely briefing him on what had taken place and requesting that he pick up the ball and carry it from then on with respect to sending a signal, and that I was available for any additional meetings or efforts to solicit.
Isn't the concept very similar to the one that was employed in the Iran arms sale?
There have been several media representatives who have speculated that there is a similarity, yes.
In your opening statement, you suggested that if you had known beforehand the intent of the officials of the government of the United States to deal in arms with Iran, but unfortunately you did not know. If you knew, what would you have done?
As I've indicated, I am working with freedom fighters who oppose totalitarianism around the world. I have been in contact with the resistance inside Iran, and those members that I am dealing with are absolutely opposed to the individuals that Oliver North and others were dealing with. I suspect that if I had known at the time that they were dealing with these people who were recognized as something less than completely reliable, I might have made some efforts to inform appropriate people in our government of my knowledge of that situation. The current resistance, the Iranian National Army, is opposed not only to the communists' efforts there today, opposed also to the current government with which Dick Secord and others were in direct contact.
Yesterday, you testified that you discussed with Colonel North your special role as, I believe you said, lightning rod for public and press attention in regard to the private funding of Contras, to take away attention from the covert activities of General Secord and Colonel North. Whose attention were you trying to distract?
Well, as I indicated, this was an unwitting benefit of my efforts to raise money. I discussed this, that if the media was tracking me, following me from one of my speeches or fundraising activities to another, they could not be following Colonel North. And if I did not have any contact with Colonel North or General Secord, whom I knew was involved in some of the more covert parts of this action, they would not be tracking them. And I pointed this out as one of the benefits that accrued to my relatively high profile, others being the fact that there was someone who was an old retired soldier who was speaking out in defense of the Contras at a time when everybody was saying how bad they were. That was a boost to their morale, and of course you can't raise funds without going public, and so that was the third benefit from
So one of the benefits that you pointed out was to divert attention away from the Congress.
No, divert the attention of the Congress and the media away from the covert
Now,
activities undergoing.
If I recall, there were stories about your successful fundraising. In fact, one article said that you raised tens of millions of dollars. Did you attempt to correct that?
Yes, I did. I have attempted to correct many of the items that appear in the press. The problem with our modern technology is that once a lie is put into the computer, anybody else can pull it up, and they do, and if it suits their purpose, they print that. My denials and efforts to correct the record don't seem to get filed for some reason.
According to the files we have, and I think this might be a good time to correct the record, in 1985, you raised $279,612, and 1986, $259 and $173. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's the dollars raised for the specific purpose of the Nicaraguan freedom fighters.
Yesterday, you testified that when you solicited Country 3, you were informed that a signal would have to be sent by the administration, the United States government, that you were acting with their support. And subsequently, you testified that in May of 1986, Assistant Secretary Abrams informed you that he would be able to provide this so-called signal. Is that correct, sir?
That's essentially correct, yes, sir.
And would you say that Secretary Abrams' willingness to provide the signal helped you in your solicitation?
Well, no, because after I had arrived in Country 3 and had made my appointments to see the head of state, I had a telephone call from Mr. Abrams who said, do not carry out your extracurricular activities there that we discussed. And I said, well, I've already made the contact. And he said, well, I know that, but don't carry through with it. I'll explain when you get back why.
Are you aware that Assistant Secretary Abrams previously told the Tower Commission that he did not offer to provide this signal because he felt that it was not right, and that has denied participating in any effort to support the Contra?
I did not know that until I read it in, I think, the New York Times or one of the papers that I read this morning.
Did that surprise you?
It did, yes.
And my final question is, did you ever obtain false U.S. passports in connection with your activities in support of the Contras?
No, absolutely not.
Chair recognizes Senator Rudman for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think I'll need the 15 minutes. General Singlaub, your life's history reads almost like fiction, but it's true. You have a very distinguished career. I think that somewhere in the record ought to show that during your service to this country, to mention only a few, I believe you're the holder of the Distinguished Service Medal, am I correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you hold awards for valor. You hold the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Soldier's Medal, and the Purple Heart.
That's correct.
And you're a very refreshing witness because you make no secret about what you've done or why you've done it. And frankly, I only intend to ask you a few questions that might either confirm or rebut some things we've heard from other witnesses, because I expect that we will get a straight answer from you. The first thing I would like to do is just clear one thing up for the record. There were two exhibits, JKS 5 and JKS 6. I think you're familiar with those two exhibits.
I see 5 and 6, yes.
Just so the record is straight, those proposals, I will call them, 5 and 6, neither were solicited by anyone in the United States government. Am I correct?
That is correct, sir.
They were, in fact, JKS 6 was not even your idea. It was the idea of an associate of yours.
That is correct.
On both occasions, you forwarded those proposals to someone in the government, I think Mr. Casey, on what, both occasions?
No, the first one was a letter that I did send to Bill Casey. The second one was sent or hand-carried by an associate to Bill Casey.
But they both went to Mr. Casey.
That is correct, yes.
But he certainly didn't solicit them, and neither proposal was adopted.
That is correct.
Yeah. I find it interesting that, and I will not review it here so not to be repetitive, but following the chairman's question about the genesis of the idea of a diversion to fund the Contras, if one wants to read JKS 6 very closely, that is truly a scheme for diversion. Am I correct?
That's correct.
I mean, that is absolutely a mirror image of what happened, except with different players and different names.
That's correct.
Thank you. I want to turn to the spring of '85 very briefly and just talk a bit about weapons. You sold some weapons to the Contras in the spring, summer of '85, and you received $5.3 million for that purchase. That's what it cost the Contras, 5.3.
That's right. The Contras paid that for the weapons that they received
Correct.
From the weapons dealer.
Yes. And in fact, you paid the supplier 4.8. You had to pay $300,000 for transportation, and you had $200,000 left, so you gave that over in the form of humanitarian aid.
There was also some other costs in there for insurance and such things. I think that at the end there was about $100,000 left, and as Adolfo Calero needed it, he would ask that that money be transferred to a variety of humanitarian aid vendors.
And you transferred every bit of it.
That's correct.
As a matter of fact, if you look at your life's history, money has never been an incentive for you. Am I correct, General Singlaub?
I'm criticized regularly for that, yes.
I'm sure. So you sold these to them in the spring of '85, and at that time you found out that General Secord's prices on the identical weapons were nearly twice yours. Am I correct?
That is correct.
And you had some discussions about this with some people.
I did.
And in fact, you reported the fact that these weapons, which they were buying through energy resources, were costing them twice as much as yours were, and you reported that to Colonel North.
I did, yes.
And he agreed, when looking at what you showed him for documentation, that your prices were enormously better than General Secord's.
That's correct.
As a matter of fact, the Contras, if you could have kept supplying it at that price, would have received 2 weapons for every one that they received under General Secord's prices. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, after you pointed that out to Colonel North, what was his reaction? Did he encourage you to go back and do some more business with the Contras?
Well, his first reaction was that when we get some more money, perhaps we can pursue the same source. That never happened, however. I believe that in the course of our discussions, there appeared to be other factors that had a bearing on the decision as to the source of weapons procurement.
The other factors are obviously referring to is the fact that General Secord was involved in another endeavor, namely the Iran arms transfer, which you did not know at that time. Am I correct?
I don't know for sure, but the facts are that I did not know about that, and that might very well have been the other problem.
But in any event, after you indicated to the man in our government who, right or wrong, and we can't determine that, somebody else will determine that, whether right or wrong, was trying to do what he could to help the Contras, and showed him that you could get them a very good price on these weapons. In fact, nothing happened. You didn't get any orders after that at all. You had the one order, and that was it.
That's correct.
In fact, you were just cut out of the deal.
That is also correct.
And as a matter of fact, since this whole story has broken, you have found out that General Secord was in a very unique position. General Secord was the recipient, either in trust or otherwise, of a huge amount of money that represented a markup on U.S. goods. Is that correct? You learned that like we all did.
That's right. Yes, sir.
And he was also in the position of controlling those monies to buy what the Contras might want from him.
I've learned that, yes.
You've learned that. And during that period that that money was being held, the Contras needed a lot of things, did they not, General Singlaub?
I must say that that is a source of great irritation to me, that I was working very hard during that time to get a few $100,000. If I had any knowledge that that money had been in a bank and was available, I would be even more furious.
And in fact, there were millions of dollars in accounts, and we have had testimony under oath to this committee that that money was being held for the enterprise. That is General Secord's testimony. Certainly, you could have done a lot with that $8 million to help the Contra cause, could you have not?
That's correct. The Contras could have used it.
General, do you have a Swiss bank account?
No.
You never had a Swiss bank account?
Never.
I'll ask you a question which you may not wish to answer, and I will not press you on it, but I will simply ask it, and you don't seem to be one who is hesitant to express a view, so if you feel like expressing one, I'll give you that opportunity. Do you think that, in light of what you heard in terms of the Mall airplanes and who claims they own them, and all of the other aircraft and who own those aircraft, and money in Swiss bank accounts, and doubling the price of arms, do you think General Secord and his associates treated the Contras as someone they really wanted to help, or somebody they wished to profit by?
You're right. I would prefer not to answer that.
You've answered it. Thank you.
Congressman Foley, 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Singlaub, I'd like to join with Senator Rudman and others on this committee in recognizing your long and distinguished active duty career in the U.S. Army.
Thank you, sir.
as one of the most decorated and dedicated officers, and one with a brilliant combat record. You have our universal respect.
Thank you, sir.
I want to take you back to the meeting you had in January of 1985 with Colonel Oliver North, when you described to him your plans to visit Country 3 and 5.
Right.
And you told him you would undertake to solicit funds or support for military assistance to the democratic resistance.
That's correct.
And he approved that and gave us his blessing, did he not?
He concurred in my doing that. Generally speaking, we had an arrangement that silence was approval if he did not want to indicate approval for some legalistic reason. In this case, if I went away feeling
you knew that if he didn't object to it, it meant his approval.
That's correct.
And he did not object.
He did not object to it.
And he, in fact, asked you to report back to him on your success, did he not?
He did.
And when you visited countries 3 and 5, you visited top officials of that government who were previously in your acquaintance.
That's correct.
And you told Colonel North you were going to do that.
I did.
And he did not object.
He did not object.
These officials of country 3 and 5 knew you as an important American Army officer who had commanded our forces in Korea.
Actually, I was not the commander in Korea. I was the chief of staff for the United Nations.
Chief of staff
for it.
in Korea.
Right.
But they knew you had that.
That's
rank.
correct.
And so there was reason to believe that you might be speaking with the concurrence of the U.S. interests, but there was not absolute sureness about that, so you thought that perhaps they needed a signal that you were acting with the approval of the U.S. government.
At least with the knowledge of the U.S. government, yes.
In fact, there wasn't any great reason for these countries to make this contribution unless they thought it was with the approval of the U.S. government, was there?
No, they also had the concern that they did not want it to be made public because it might create some problems with the Congress, whom they relied upon for support. They did not want to openly defy the will of the Congress as expressed in the Boland Amendment.
So the only way that they would be willing to do this is if they thought that their confidence would be respected, that they would not be seen as opposing the will of Congress, and that they would in fact have the approval of the U.S. executive branch.
That's correct, sir.
And they would have no reason at all to do it if they didn't feel that it had the approval of the executive branch.
That's correct.
So when you talked to them about a signal of approval from the U.S. executive branch, that signal was a rather important, if not essential, maybe an essential part perhaps, of a successful solicitation. Is that correct?
I believe that it was, yes.
And without such a signal, they could not be expected to agree to the solicitation.
They might have, but I concluded that they probably would not if they did not.
Let me put it this way. If they did not feel that there was evidence that the U.S. executive branch wished them to make this contribution, is it your opinion that they would not have made the contribution?
That's correct, yes, sir.
So I would, rephrasing the question, the knowledge of the approval, however obtained, of the U.S. executive branch was an essential part of a successful solicitation by you of country 3 and 5.
Yes, I believe that's correct.
And you returned and did report to Colonel North.
Yes.
Did Colonel North ever tell you whether he reported to his superiors on your report to him?
Yes, he did tell me that he had reported it.
Did he say who those superiors were?
No.
Did you have any opinion as to who they were?
I assumed it was to Bud McFarland, who was at that time the advisor.
You also testified you discussed with Colonel North the possibility of foreign nationals conducting operations, military operations, for the Nicaraguan assistance inside Nicaragua, and the Colonel North stated that he had already hired a former SAS officer. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
What is the SAS again, for the record?
Special Air Service
And it is a service of what country?
of Great Britain.
Did he give you the name of the officer formerly associated with the SAS?
I'm not sure that I remember whether I heard it at that time or whether I've learned it since then.
But you have reason to believe now that you do know the name of the
Yes.
officer? And you're satisfied that's a correct report?
That's correct.
And
Yes,
who is that officer?
Colonel Walker.
Formerly British SAS Colonel?
That's correct.
Did Colonel North describe to you the plans of such an SAS operation in Nicaragua?
Yes, in general terms, not into the specifics of clandestine entry and some of those details.
But in broad outlines, he discussed
Yes,
that
he did.
operation with you. What was that operation?
The operation was basically to infiltrate a team of non-U.S. Personnel into the vicinity of the airfield at Managua with a view of destroying the Hind D helicopters that were known to be located there.
Was that operation ever conducted, to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge.
When you planned your second trip to Country 3 and 5, that was in the spring of 1986?
Yes, sir.
And you testified that you spoke with Assistant Secretary Elliot Abrams about the need for a signal?
That's correct. Yes,
And
sir.
he agreed to give that signal?
He did.
And then while you were in Country 3, he contacted you and told you not to make the solicitation.
That's correct.
And you told him that it was awkward because you had already made it.
Right.
And
That I'd already made the
arrangements for the appointment.
Right.
When you returned from the trip, did you testified you spoke to Secretary Abrams,
That's correct.
and you told him that it was embarrassing for you that this was countermanded, this
Yes.
agreement by him to give the signal was countermanded by him. What did he tell you was the reason why he changed his mind?
He indicated that the solicitation was going to be made at the highest level, which, as I testified yesterday, I assumed was someone in the White House, if it was true.
When you're speaking with an Assistant Secretary of State and he refers to the highest level, that would be normally something you would assume to be from the White House?
Above George Shultz, yes.
Right. How many people are above George Shultz in
Not
the U.S.
many.
government? General, are you familiar with a firm in Marietta, Georgia called Vista Distribution or Vista Distributors?
No.
No such firm? Reviewing your testimony yesterday, you stated you obtained from Colonel North's concurrence and approval on your proposed arms purchase in April 1985, and you presented him with a list of weapons. You
That's
recall
correct,
it?
yes.
Was any other official of the U.S. government present during this conversation with Colonel North?
To the best of my recollection, I don't believe there was anyone else there.
You-
Seldom was there anyone else in his office when he and I
And in
met.
this conversation, your best recollection is that no one else was present?
No one else from the U.S. government. I think that Adolfo Calero was with me, however.
That Mr. Calero was present with you?
I believe he was, because we were working this together.
I see. Was anyone else, any other private citizen besides Mr. Calero present with you and Colonel North at that time?
Not at the time that I went over the final list of small arms.
Who else did you meet with when you met with Colonel North on other occasions when Mr. Calero was present? Were there others present between at
Yes,
those meetings?
on one other occasion, I assume you're referring to this in the former testimony, Adolfo Calero and I went in and found, to our surprise, that General Secord was in the office with Colonel North.
And so at that time, the discussion took place between you, Mr. Calero, General Secord, and Mr. Colonel North.
Right.
Colonel North, according to your testimony, outlined to you in 1984 or early 1985 what you must do to be legal in purchasing arms for the Nicaraguan resistance?
That's correct. We discussed this.
And he said
something.
that he had discussed it with lawyers and officials in the Justice Department?
That's correct.
Did he tell you which lawyers
No, he did
discussed
not.
it with? Just said generally those
That's correct.
lawyers. And the sum of his advice was that you couldn't use American bank accounts or use American transport or American companies?
Or conduct the operations from the United States. That's correct.
Are you familiar with the Neutrality Act?
Yes, I am.
Did you understand those conditions to be related to compliance with the Neutrality Act?
Yes.
Did you ever discuss with Colonel North the Boland Amendment?
Yes.
And did you express concern to him at any time about compliance with the Boland Amendment?
Not with my compliance. It's quite clear, even in that very complicated amendment,
Did you ever
that it
discuss
does
with
not
him-
apply to a person like myself.
Yes, but did you ever discuss with him his compliance with the Boland Amendment?
Yes.
And what did he tell you?
Well, I believe that there was a disagreement among the lawyers with whom he had been in contact as to whether or not it applied to the National Security Council and to the White House.
These are official lawyers,
I understand them to
government
be,
lawyers.
yes.
And you got the impression from him that some lawyers had told him that he was not covered by the Boland Amendment, and other lawyers had told him that he was.
Yes, that's correct.
So some of the legal advice that he was receiving was that he was in violation of the Boland Amendment by the activities that he was undertaking.
That is correct, so we decided that we would plan for the worst case, which was that it did apply, and we attempted then to work within those parameters.
Was there also a consideration of secrecy and avoidance of publicity in order to avoid any focus on the violations that might occur of the Boland Amendment?
Yes, that certainly was a major factor.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. DeWine for 5 minutes.
General, I want to first thank you very much for your testimony and also thank you for a lifetime of service to this country. Your record is unbelievably impressive. I just have a couple brief questions. General, do you know a man, or did you ever know a man by the name of Sam Hall?
Yes.
Okay. Could you tell us how you knew him and what your relationship was?
I don't remember exactly how I first met him. I know that he continually attempted to volunteer to join my efforts. It did not take very long to realize that he not only did not have the qualifications that he suggested he had, but that he probably needed medical care.
All right. General, did you ever give him any kind of money at any point?
I believe that I paid for a trip that he made, whether it was at my request or whether someone else working with me had asked him to go along to escort some of the refugee relief type funds that were being sent down. We earmarked some of the humanitarian assistance to go to the Indians, and we wanted to be sure that they got over there because there was some accusations that someone unspecified in the system was siphoning off these supplies and this equipment before it reached its final destination. So generally speaking, we would try to send someone along, and that involved paying their expenses, but no compensation.
So that was the relationship then? That's what he did?
That's correct.
And that was on just one occasion or two, or?
I believe it was only on one occasion. He also submitted to me a plan which was outrageous in its scope and its amateurism, and I think that was filed in the circular file in my office.
If I could summarize, or maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think what you're telling us is this is someone who is well-intentioned, but you did not really have a great deal of involvement with besides this one or two occasions.
That's right. I think he suffered from a Walter Mitty type complex, and I felt sorry for him, really.
Thank you, General.
Senator Mitchell?
General Singlaub, you've described two meetings with Elliott Abrams, one before your second trip to the Pacific and the other upon your return. And as you are now aware, your version of what was said during those meetings conflicts sharply with the version provided by Mr. Abrams to the Tower Commission. My question is, was anyone else present at either of those two meetings?
The best of my recollection, it was either Bill Walker, his deputy, or Rich Melton, who is another one of his associates. There were either one or two present when that was discussed.
Now, was that the meeting before you left or upon your return, or at both meetings?
Both meetings. I had had quite a few meetings, so it's a little not quite clear in my mind, but I do remember that in practically every occasion there was someone else with us when we met. I can't think of an occasion when there was not another one of his assistants there.
So it is your recollection that at both of the meetings there was another person present, and you believe that it was one or both of Mr. Abrams' assistants present at both meetings?
That's correct, yes, sir.
Right. And he used the phrase, according to your testimony, that the solicitation was to be at the highest level?
That's correct, yes.
Right. And did you inquire as to what he meant by that?
No, that was fairly clear to me that it was going to be somebody from the White House who, or the NSC that was going to do this or had done it.
Well, you testified earlier it would be someone higher than Secretary of State Schultz?
Yes, I felt when he would have said someone higher in the department or made some reference to the Secretary, but he indicated in words which I'm not positive were the highest level, but at a higher level or something similar to that, indicating to me that that would be outside of the department and probably in the White House. That's the impression that he was trying to give me, I'm confident.
Right. Thank you very much, General Singlaub. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, much has been made of the word secrecy around here, as though there's something wrong with not doing things in the bright, burning sunlight. Isn't it true that Honduras would prefer a very low profile on what's going on down there? They are not exactly thrilled with the confrontation with Nicaragua and the fact that there are Contra bases there and a few other things. They just assume low profile that. Isn't that true?
That is true of Honduras. It's also true of several of the other countries in Central America and their involvement. They would like to have that minimized because they have to live with Nicaragua regardless.
So the fact that you're trying to assist the Contras down there without a brass band and flags flying doesn't make what you're doing any less meritorious, does it?
Well, I hope not. There are lots of things that I have done that I believe to be meritorious that were not only secret but top secret.
Very good. Now, against the wall over there is a blow-up of the Punta Huete airstrip. We've heard a lot about briefings. See, we had 3 lovely people in this morning who were brought into Washington for a briefing, and I was always curious about what these briefings contained. Now, one of the things I would suspect would be that airfield that is being built down in Nicaragua, which I am told will have a 10,000-foot runway capable of accommodating any Soviet aircraft in their inventory. That includes the backfire bomber, the Bear D reconnaissance aircraft, and that it's strictly a military facility with anti-aircraft guns deployed around the airfield. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
Does that pose a threat to the neighbors of Managua, Nicaragua? What about Costa Rica? What about the Panama Canal? Would it be much of a flight from that air base to the Panama Canal?
Well, I believe that there are probably other airfields there that are a threat over those short distances. It's the fact that this will accommodate their intercontinental bombers and reconnaissance aircraft.
What other purpose would there be for a 10,000-foot runway?
None, sir.
Well, we go to Cuba and we see that the facility at Lourdes near Havana. Are you familiar with that, General?
Yes, I am.
That's a Soviet intelligence collection facility, and I'm informed that this listening post enables the Soviets to monitor sensitive United States maritime, military, and space communications, as well as telephone conversations in the United States. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Now, if they duplicate that facility in Nicaragua, which of course they will do, we will have the same aircraft going up the west coast of our country. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct, sir.
Right off of Silicon Valley. Well, now another interesting subject, I would assume, of these briefings would be the Corinto port facility in Nicaragua. That is being made into a deep water port, and I presume the dredging that's going on down there is for submarines. Would that be correct?
It's not necessary for the normal shipping that you would expect going in and out of that country for commerce.
All right, so those are things that ought to concern a reasonably alert person who understands the correlation of forces. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Hyde.
Now, you mentioned the Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters as the greatest people-killing machine in the world. They're flying tanks, aren't they?
Literally they are, because they have such good armor plate on them, it's very difficult to shoot them down. They have the types of weapon systems that are designed to kill people.
Now the Nicaraguan Sandinistas also have Soviet troop-carrying helicopters too, do they not?
They do have, yes, Mi-8s.
And all of this is part, I suppose, of last year of 23,000 metric tons of Soviet material poured into the Sandinista government. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
We have been supplying the Contras with miserly little bits of weapons and an unlimited quantity of the Boland Amendment while this has been going on, in the hopes they can roll them up, you know, and throw them at these helicopters maybe. Now, the Caribbean, let's talk about that for a minute. That's an important body of water. I'm told half of our imports, half of our exports, 3/4 of our petroleum imports pass through the maritime lanes of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. Is that true?
That is correct, and in addition to that, over 50% of our support for our NATO allies as well as our forces goes through that same waterway.
So if you flank that important waterway with Cuba on one side and a Soviet base in Nicaragua on the other side, you've got a pretty tough situation for the import and export in this country of materiel, troops, everything. Is that correct?
That is correct. It will force the United States into a decision to either dishonor its NATO commitment or commit troops to attack those fields in Cuba and in Nicaragua.
Now, General, you of all people in the world are acutely aware of the Soviet-supported North Korean situation, which is a constant threat to South Korea and Japan. I suppose the Army was important to you. You attained 2-star rank, General, and I suppose your career was important to you, but you left the Army over a dispute of policy with the White House when you had a very high post in Korea. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
It's my recollection that the Korean War was ignited by a statement from our then Secretary of State which excluded South Korea from the perimeter of strategic interests which this country had.
That is correct.
And Harry Truman, I suppose, surprised the North Koreans, not to say the Chinese and the Soviets, by responding responding rather promptly to the invasion of the South by the North. But they were kind of invited in by this statement excluding South Korea from our range of interests. Is that correct?
It was certainly the wrong signal to send at that time.
Well, aren't we sending a similar signal to the Soviet Union in Nicaragua by our on-again, off-again, limp-wristed, I grope for a word and I can only find wimpish support for the Contras over the years? Aren't we saying it isn't all that important to us?
I think that we are, and certainly if you talk to any of our allies, they think that it's totally irrational for us to take this type of a chance.
I mean, let's make up our mind. We don't have all that much margin for error, do we?
We do not, sir.
I take it the bell is terminating my dialogue, and I have several more things to discuss with you, General. Let me close with the indulgence of just seeing if you agree with a statement by a reporter for the New York Times named Henry Kam, who said communism is the most sustained assault against the human spirit in human history. Would you agree with that statement?
I certainly do.
And we ought to, as we look at the globe, Afghanistan, Angola, Cameron Bay, North Korea, we ought to be a little, Cuba, Nicaragua, we ought to be concerned about it, oughtn't we?
I believe we should, yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Singlaub, I'd like to address your attention to Exhibit number 6, if you have it there.
Yes, sir.
Now, this memorandum, which states that the objective is to create a conduit for maintaining a continuous flow of Soviet weapons and technology to be utilized by the United States in its support of freedom fighters in Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Angola, Cambodia, Ethiopia, etc. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And then it states that the problem is with each passing year, Congress has become increasingly unpredictable and uncooperative regarding the President's desire to support the cause of freedom fighters. So the problem that this memo sees is that the Congress is not acceding to the President's request easily to support these freedom fighters. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So this was to work out a scheme to get around the Congress. Would that be fair to say?
It's a scheme to avoid having to appropriate funds from the taxpayer in order to carry out the national policy of this country, yes.
But to do that, you would have to use this country because to make the scheme work, we would have to provide high technology equipment and information to country A. Country A would then provide sophisticated weapons to country B, and country B would then supply Soviet-type weapons to a trading company to provide to these insurgencies. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And so this whole scheme could work with the U.S. government's involvement in kicking it off, priming the pump, as it were, by providing high technology equipment and information. And there's a chart that sets out this three-way trade. Is that correct? And then over on the following page it says, in the third paragraph, in terms of results, the United States then has at its disposal a large and continuous supply of Soviet technology and weapons to channel to freedom fighters worldwide, mandating neither the consent or awareness of the Department of State or Congress. Is that correct?
That's what the document says, yes.
Now, let me just say, I regard this as serious a concern as anything that I've seen that's come before us in this hearings, because fully developed, this was a scheme whereby a flow of weapons could be provided all over the world without the knowledge of the Congress or the State Department, according to this memo, and without accountability. Now, let me ask you about the memo, because you touched on it only briefly in your testimony. You indicated that you had seen this document yesterday. And where was it you saw it?
I'm afraid I can't be specific. It was discussed with me or shown to me as being something that was being briefed to officials here in Washington. I don't honestly remember whether it was in an office or whether it was at my hotel.
Who showed it to you?
The president of Militech.
All right, and you say you saw it before it was presented to Director Casey. You said that yesterday?
Yes, I did.
All right. Now, you were asked whether you knew whether or not this document was presented to any other individuals apart from Director Casey. And you said, I believe that it was discussed with Oliver North. And then you went on to say, I know that it was discussed with former senior officials of the U.S. government. Who were those former senior officials?
Do I have to answer that? Former Secretary of State Alexander Haig was one of them. Another was former National Security Advisor Richard Allen. I believe that it was discussed with some others, but at this point I don't really remember. And I know this only by hearsay, not for first-hand knowledge.
Mm-hmm. And you think it was discussed with Oliver North? This memo was found in North's safe, incidentally, I'm told by the staff of the committee. And you understood it was presented to Director Casey. The memo says on the last page, we have received, the last paragraph of the last page, we have received confirmation from blank and blank that they are most interested in pursuing their role in this trade arrangement. Upon your encouragement and belief that the United States could perform its role, we will proceed with those countries to implement it. Who do you understand your encouragement and belief? Whose encouragement and belief was this memo addressed to?
I believe it was for Director Casey.
And who are the we who will proceed?
I have to assume that that's the company that originated the document.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask one final question. How do you think the decisions for the United States to help a resistance movement should be made?
Well, this is a policy at the present time. A foreign policy is made by the executive branch. There's been some debate as whether it originates in the National Security Council or whether it originates in the Department of State. But generally speaking, the initiative in accordance with our Constitution is that it comes from the executive branch with the advice and consent of the Senate and with the House appropriating the necessary funds to carry it out.
Well, this then was, although you labeled it a good plan, it in effect is a plan to get around the constitutional system that would require the President and the Congress acting together to make these policy decisions, would it not?
There are many decisions that would have to be made in this document. That is, the release of the high technology requires the decisions of the government. It would have to have the approval of the U.S. government. But what it does not, what it avoids is having to appropriate funds for the purpose of carrying out these support operations, which are generally covert, for the resistance forces, the democratic resistance forces around the world.
When you disagreed with President Carter on the withdrawal of American troops from Korea, did you go to the Congress to present your case?
I was summoned to the Congress to present my case, yes.
And did you feel the Congress had a role to play with respect to that decision?
They did, yes.
Do you think the Congress should have a role to play with respect to decisions of the sort that are contained in this memo?
As long as it does not interfere with the sovereignty of this country and the requirements placed upon the President to defend this country against its enemies.
Would you say that you think the Congress should be involved when their involvement will support the substance of your position, but not involved when their involvement would not support the substance of your position?
I guess I don't understand the question, Senator Sarbanes.
Well, in the Korean situation, you thought Congress should be involved. Congress supported your position. In this situation, I take it you think Congress should not be involved because Congress was not supporting your position.
Well, I don't think that I have said that the Congress should not be involved. What I'm saying is that the Congress has shown an inconsistent position with respect to supporting the President's announced policy. It was the policy of this country to support the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. We gave them money, we gave them encouragement, and we placed them in harm's way. When they were in that position, we suddenly withdrew that assistance, and then later gave them a little bit more assistance, and finally we're back to where we were before with the full support of the Congress. It's the inconsistency that is creating the problem in this situation, and the actions that I have taken without any remorse is to try to keep the Nicaraguan freedom fighters alive during this temporary hiatus in support.
Well, I only close with the observation that you were prepared, apparently, to structure a system
that we
that
call
would
on Congressman Cheney.
Mr.
McCollum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamilton. I just wanted to ask a clarifying question, General Singlaub. Earlier today, this afternoon, you testified, as I recall, that you and Colonel North discussed the Boland Amendment and decided to live within it, even though there were some mixed interpretations of law about it, by assuming the worst case that perhaps the NSC would be covered by it. Am I correct? Is that what you testified to?
That's correct, yes.
You were then asked if you had decided to avoid publicity about your actions. And I didn't quite understand your response to that. I don't understand why you decided that or if you decided that. That isn't clear to me, and I would like you to clarify it if you would.
I was involved in openly supporting the Nicaraguan freedom fighters, both in terms of education, giving speeches, telling what I believe to be the truth based upon my observations on the site. And I was also conducting fundraising activities to include writing letters, to include giving speeches, raising funds, trying to coordinate the efforts of a large number of conservative organizations here. And in doing that, the media started to report on it. When the media started to report on it and giving me more visibility than I wanted, I discussed this with Colonel North, who expressed concern that since I visited him frequently and many people knew that we were friends, it might impact adversely upon his situation. We discussed that there were advantages, the one that I've mentioned, that it's useful for fundraising. I also pointed out that there were two other advantages to my high profile at the time, and that is it was a boost to the morale of the Nicaraguan freedom fighters who had felt that they had been betrayed in some cases by this turnoff of funds. And third, it did in fact serve as sort of a lightning rod if the press was following me and asking me questions about this aid, and I was working clearly within the Boland Amendment and every other law that I thought existed. Then that would take the heat off of those who were trying to be more covert in their actions. Whether
the implication of that answer, the implication of it before, to some extent, was that the Boland Amendment indeed was being violated, and that therefore that's why you were seeking to avoid the publicity. That's the implication that could be read into that.
I regret that that's the case, but as Congressman Hyde pointed out, our concern was primarily to avoid embarrassing those countries who were providing assistance on the ground and did not want to admit publicly that there were Nicaraguan freedom fighter base camps on their territory, and that some of their airfields were being used in support of the Nicaraguan democratic resistance.
And the avoiding of publicity had nothing to do with the Boland Amendment as such, then? Your comments with regard to that?
Certainly not with respect to my activity.
And, well, with respect to Colonel North's activity?
As far as I know, Colonel North was operating within the law.
Well, I think that's an important...
Within the Boland Amendment.
I wanted to clarify. I think it's an important point. I don't know. I don't think any of us know precisely what a court of law would determine to be the applicability of the Boland Amendment to the National Security Council. That's yet to be determined. But I think it's very important that we know what you intended to say today and that it be perfectly clear on the record, because there are a lot of implications that are written. You've already testified today about how sometimes your words get taken the wrong way, and I wanted to set that very clearly straight.
I appreciate that clarification.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That's the sole purpose of my asking for some time. Thank you.
Senator Cohen?
You indicated earlier that you went to visit Mr. Pastor, I believe, in March of 1986.
Yes.
And you reached an agreement with Mr. Pastor about him re-entering Nicaragua?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And you also indicated that you had cleared this and got the agreement of Elliott Abrams in permitting you to go and so-called reach this agreement?
He posed no objections to my doing this, although he pointed out the hazards involved.
But you presented it to him in terms of what you intended to do.
Yes.
But you also indicated, I believe, that you thought Colonel North would have some objections to it?
I knew that he was one of those who had concluded that the benefits from dealing with Comandante Zero were not overriding the problems, the burdens.
What intrigues me is this particular agreement says the United States will do the following. Under what authority were you able to reach such an agreement and commit the resources of the United States?
I had no authority to represent the United States. I was trying to distinguish between Comandante Zero's forces and those of us in the United States that were anxious to help him and get him back in. It's an unfortunate choice of words. The thing was written out by hand in a relatively short period of time. I just, at the moment, couldn't think of another way of representing my side because I didn't want to say that it was me. I represented a large number of conservative groups.
I think you also indicated that you believe someone in the CIA had sabotaged that effort?
That's correct, yes, sir.
Did you complain to Director Casey about it?
No, I did not. We did not discuss Nicaragua.
One final question to follow up, and Chairman, in a way. You indicated before, had you known about the Iranian initiative, you would have objected to it.
Yes, sir.
Primarily because of the people that were involved?
Yes. It's my view that there is a better group of people in Iran to deal with than those that are closely associated with the Ayatollah.
You objected to Mr. Ghorbanifar, Khashoggi?
That's correct.
And their reputations were well known within the community that you were circulating in?
That's correct.
Okay, and if it were possible, in your judgment, to raise money by selling arms to the Iranians in order to take the profit and send it to the Contras, you would have approved that?
No, I had taken a very strong position several years ago that I did not think that we wanted to sell arms to the current government in Iran. It was not in the best interest of the United States.
As Chairman Inouye pointed out, what took place in effect was they took your proposal for country number 3 that you gave as an option in 1985 and they applied it to country X, or Iran, right?
It appears that there is some similarity, but there is a difference.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Senator Hatch?
General Singlaub, let me just take a few minutes with you. First of all, I want to tell you that I've appreciated you through all these years and appreciate the service you've given to our country. You parachuted into occupied France during World War II, helped the French resistance. You parachuted later into the Japanese prisoner of war camp. You jumped into the heart of the the major struggles in Korea and elsewhere, and you've jumped into the heart of this matter, and I think you've done a very good job within the framework of your own personal beliefs and what you're trying to do. But let me just say this. You've been involved in military operations almost all of your life, and are there times when covert actions are actually necessary?
It's certainly my belief that that is the case.
There isn't a major country in this world that conducts foreign policy without covert actions. Is that correct?
I know of none.
I know of none either. As a matter of fact, you can't even deal with some countries unless you do it in a secret or covert way. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And some of the most important allies in the world depend upon our dealing with them in a covert or secret way.
That's correct.
All right. Now, one of the things that interested me when Senator Sarbanes was questioning you was on this Exhibit 6. Now, I noticed that you, Mr. Dudley or Mr. Dutton or both, came up with this, I believe, came up with this particular memorandum. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Sorry. All I can say is that this particular memorandum does provide alternative proposals with regard to covert action or covert proposals to try and resolve some of the problems down in Nicaragua. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you do indicate in there that, excuse me, let me turn this thing off. It does say in here that that with each passing year, Congress has become increasingly unpredictable and uncooperative regarding the President's desire to support the cause of freedom fighters despite growing Soviet aggression, or oppression is the word. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that part of it.
One of the problems that I've seen here really has been Congress, and Congress has been very critical of everything that's happened here, critical of the President, critical of people on the National Security Council, critical of people on the outside. We have lots of criticism. But, you know, if you look at the history of the Boland Amendments, and I think Mr. Boland's one of the fine people in the Congress, but he has to live with the Congress itself. So when he passes amendments, they're generally compromises. They're generally language that try to please a whole raft of people, sometimes very difficult to please. But here we have 1 year aid is allowed as long as it's not used by the CIA to overthrow the Nicaraguan government or the Sandinistas. The next year it's permitted so long as the DOD and the CIA do not engage in the list of specific activities under the amendment. The next year it's allowed basically with no restrictions or very few restrictions at all, do you see? The next year aid, direct or indirect, is forbidden. The next year, aid is permitted again, but only if it is humanitarian. Finally, aid is resumed basically without condition. And then the Congress passes $100 million, as though it's really going to do something down here, $70 million of which is allowed to be used for lethal assistance with relatively few restrictions. Now, is that a set of instructions from the Congress that any president can really live with, or any battle commander can live with, or any Contra force can live with, and be effective?
I don't think that anyone can live with that kind of inconsistency and on-again, off-again type activity.
I think that's why the President has called for private assistance here. And he's been very open about it, that he needed private assistance. We have to keep this cause alive. This whole hemisphere depends on what happens. And am I correct in perhaps concluding that the President didn't know what to do with Congress? Congress has given all these inconsistencies and inconsistent approaches, and that's really been the problem here, hasn't it?
As far as I'm concerned, that is it, sir.
Well, I think it is too. And I think Congress ought to look to itself a little bit here before criticizing everybody else, even though, let's face it, the intentions were noble, the process was wrong. And there were things wrong here with what went on. But I think what we ought to be trying to do is solve these problems and go on from here and start solving the problems instead of wasting so much time trying to nail somebody's hide to the wall. And that's what sometimes it seems to me we're doing around here. Do you differ with that?
No, I believe, as you have described it, we are facing a self-inflicted wound. I don't think it's necessary.
Well, I think you summed it up better than I ever could. Thank you, sir.
General Singlaub, in behalf of the Joint Committee, may I thank you for assisting us in this investigation and subjecting yourself to this intensive interrogation. We appreciate it very much. Before being excused, would you care to Identify your counsel.
Counsel is Robert Kelly from the John Sears Law Offices.
Thank you, sir. Several exhibits have not been entered into the record, so at this moment, without objection, the following will be made part of the permanent record: Exhibit 6, Exhibits 74 through 77A, Exhibits G, J, S 1 through 2, Exhibits AC 1 to AC 6, Exhibits JKS 1 to 8, JC 1 and 2, ECG 1 to 3, WBO 1. Also, Exhibits 75 through 77, which were admitted on Friday, May the 8th, will be renumbered Exhibits 28B and 28D. JKS 9 will also be made part of the permanent record. I wish to announce at this time that this hearing will resume at 9 a.m. next Wednesday and will continue on till Friday that week. It will be conducted in room 2154 of the Rayburn Building. Our next witness, who will appear at 9 a.m. next Wednesday.
That's 2172 Rayburn Building.
I'm sorry, it was 2172 Rayburn Building. Our next witness will be Mr. Albert Hakim. Then, beginning on June the 2nd through June the 4th, the hearings will resume in this room, beginning at 9 a.m. This afternoon, we initiated the Hamilton Plan for expedited hearings. That is why we are able to adjourn before 5:30.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
may I thank you very much and the members of your committees for allowing me this opportunity to express my views before this group and for the kind remarks that have been made with respect to my previous activities. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. The hearing will stand in recess until